Hi, Danny here from the Joshua Tree, and thanks for joining us as we continue to get our focus on God and see what perspective that has for life. When you think of God, do you have a particular characteristic that comes to the fore? Are there particular people that you think are godly people or whom God shows his favour on? Perhaps there are times where we experience a sense of God's closeness, when we experience the blessing of being with others, or seeing that his purposes are good and that his ways are healthy. There's other times where we might have doubts, when we might struggle, where we might really be wrestling with understanding whether God exists or not. Today, as we work our way through the book of Joshua, we get a second and contrasting picture that gives us a fullness to understand the breadth with which God relates to different people in different circumstances, but also the similarity with which he relates to all people. We're going to see today that God delivers mercy. Now mercy is sort of undeserved kindness. We might think of it in a situation where our organisation is getting through a restructure. We know that our position in that is quite unstable, and so we make our case to be a part of the future direction. It might also be in a relationship when we know that we've hurt someone. We know that the other person has within their rights to be angry at us, and we plead for forgiveness, for a mercy, an undeserved kindness, hoping that the other person would give to us what we don't deserve so that we can be reconciled. And so today we see how mercy operates in the way that God relates to his people, and we're going to get started in Joshua chapter 2. Have a look at verse 1. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Now, for those who are familiar with the story, Joshua is the 6th book of the Bible, and God has been bringing his people towards this land that he's promised. But there's been many obstacles along the way, mostly to do with the lack of faith that God's people demonstrate. And here, as they're approaching the land, as there's a setting apart of 2 spies, there's some memories that are evoked. There's some bad memories. Joshua himself had been one of 12 spies who had gone to this very land to consider what it looked like and what it would be for God's people to inhabit it. He came back with confidence that God would deliver this, but besides Caleb, the 10 other spies came back with fear and disbelief. And so here we see that Joshua just secretly, I think perhaps from the rest of the Israelite community, sets aside 2 spies to go and look at the land. And we start to see that there's a healthy paradigm in this new generation. Joshua is leading effectively. Go and look, he says. And there's a healthy response in obedience. So they went. And the special focus is this location of Jericho. This was going to be a specific city that God had set apart for God's people to enter into. It was smack bang in the middle of the promised land. It's not sort of some outskirts. It's something that would be pivotal, it would be recognizable, and it would make a statement about what God is doing. And so the spies head towards the land, but then things seem to take a bit of a downward trend. We see that their first stop is the house of a prostitute named Rahab. And so straight away we get a sense that perhaps things aren't going to be better for this new generation. That perhaps these spies are showing disbelief in a whole range of different ways. That again, they're going to be morally compromised. And so we see what happens then from verse 2. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." Things seem to be going from bad to worse. Not only did the 2 spies go into the home of a prostitute, but now we see that the king of Jericho is keenly aware of their presence in the city. And so the great enemy, the political force, the military force, seem to have full insight into the work of these spies. If they were sort of doing a spy test, I don't think they'd be passing very well so far. But the question is, what's going to happen here for Rahab? What does it look like for her? Well, I think the expectation at this point is that she would comply with her patriotic duty that it would be good for her to dob in these two spies, that it would enable her to increase in status and influence within Jericho itself. Verse 4, but the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. It's a bit of a surprise, isn't it? And the suspense increases. For Rahab, this is a dangerous decision. This is an act of treason. For anyone who watches spy movies, this is the idea of espionage. The ramifications will be great for her if it's exposed that she has lied to the king, that she's compromised the security of the city. Verse 6, but she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. We see here that Rahab's commitment isn't to herself, it's not to the king, but it's actually towards these strangers. Because at this point, she is risking everything. So the question is, why is she protecting them? But perhaps we also need to ask at this point, is she protecting them? Because now it's night and the city gates are shut, their life is in her hands. And so the big question I think now is, what's God going to do about this? Is God's plan going to fail? Has this decision to send some spies into the land actually been the decision that is going to stop God's promises being realized? Verse 8, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Here's where we start to get a sense of Rahab's motivations. And we get a sense of this in the confession that she makes. She realizes that this land has got particular purposes for the Israelites' God. She and the rest of the city has become overwhelmed with this sense of hearts melting in fear because of what God has demonstrated. God has been working. And as was predicted, as the Israelites exited Egypt and they sang of what was to come as they headed towards the land that God was promising, God's enemies are starting to shiver in their boots. Verse 10, we've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now, obviously, communication didn't travel as fast as it does today, but certainly significant events were reported. And so the people in Jericho have heard what God's done. And they're responding with their hearts melting in fear. They're sort of, just as they hear the news, they're losing heart in their own status within the wider geographical area. It's this picture of being sort of seized with anxiety about the competency of their opposition. Their hearts literally dissolve, and so their courage is failing them. And so here we get a great contrast. We saw in chapter 1 that with Joshua having God's presence near to him, as he walked in obedience, as the people meditated on his word, they would be strong. They would be courageous. As the people of Jericho hear what the Lord is doing, literally courage is just falling out of them. Their hearts are melting away. Their confidence is being stripped. And so for Rahab, as she gets a sense that the God who is moving the Israelite people is a God who can't be messed with, she realizes that the right response is to plead for mercy. You see here, there's a confession. God is mighty. He's overcome the strongest opponent, the Egyptians. He's been majestic in working even beyond and against natural means. But there's a sense that Rahab understands that although this God is powerful and mighty, that he doesn't necessarily have to be distant. And so she is wanting to relate to God. She's wanting to be on the right side of God, and she's willing to even risk her own life and the reputation and the position with the king of Jericho to experience being in relationship with God. And so she progresses from the confession of who she understands God to be with a plea. Verse 12. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you'll show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you'll spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you'll save us from death. We see here in Rahab's request that she desires for God, through his people, to bring about certainty of ongoing relationship. There's this plea that there would be a reciprocating nature. The way that she is showing kindness now, so too God would show kindness to her and her family. There's a plea for a relationship. There's a desire for her loyalty to be rewarded. And so Rahab and her family bring a request that their lives would be saved. Verse 14, our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. Here we start to see this idea of substitution. There would have to be a cost. This is going to be a conditional agreement. Verse 15, so she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. This is the plan. Rahab is wanting to protect them, to keep her end of the bargain, and she wants them to keep their end. And now this little section from verse 15 sort of seems to be out of sequence. This is a common occurrence in the book of Joshua. And I think that as we get a sense that there's overarching messages that are wanting to be emphasized, that often the sequential detail is a little bit adjusted so that we capture this. We see the terms of the agreement though from verse 17, which I don't think isn't with them being negotiated at the other end of the rope out the window, but was prior to them exiting the window. Now the men had said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us, unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. We see here the three criteria in the arrangement. Firstly, this very symbolic scarlet cord needs to be hung out of the window to remind the Israelites as they're entering into Jericho, this picture that reminds them of the symbol that they had to show in Egypt as they put the blood of the sacrifice above their doorstep so that the Lord would pass over. So too they would see this scarlet cord hanging down and pass over Rahab and her family. And the second criteria is that Rahab's whole family would be within the house. The third requirement that we see from verse 20 is that this all must be kept secret until the time when the Israelites come. Verse 20, but if you tell what we are doing, we'll be released from the oath you made us swear. Agreed, she replied. Let it be as you say. So she sent them away and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. These are the three conditions that form the agreement. And God's spies are saying that they can be trusted, that Rahab can have confidence, that God will honour this agreement that has been made. And so verse 22, when they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days. until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the two men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us." And so this spy investigation trip has been a success. They've returned to Joshua without being found, and it says that they told Joshua everything. So I think there's a sense that although there's suspicion about their intentions in entering the house of Rahab a prostitute, there's a sense that in full disclosure, they didn't morally compromise themselves as they entered that place. And what they report is that all of Jericho is melting in fear. They've heard what God has done. They know what God can do, and they are humbled. And so the difference here, I think, in this report back to Joshua, as opposed to the 12 spies who gave a report back to Moses in the previous generation, is that it's not sort of a personal assessment on the place. It's not about strategic plans about what's going to be needed to conquer this place. But there is a great confidence that God is evidently going to deliver this place to his people. And sure enough, in chapter 6, as we see the people enter Jericho, God delivers the land, but he also delivers mercy to Rahab. Chapter 6, verse 22. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brother and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Chapters 1 and 2 of Joshua give us this great contrast of Joshua, who was going to be the faithful leader, who's going to be strong and courageous, that God was going to be present with him. And then Rahab, sort of at the bottom of the social structures in their greatest opponent. But within this spectrum is a picture of who God has the ability to deliver mercy to, who God will call and invite to be one of his own. And so Rahab becomes this great example of how God delivers mercy. And it's a great example of what faith looks like. Rahab is listed in the genealogy of Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 1. She's listed as someone who is pivotal, that God was working powerfully in to display his purposes. That there is no one, even sort of the lowest and most perhaps potentially socially excluded person within the greatest opponent of God, the people of Jericho, God desires and God has the ability to draw them to himself. Rahab is also listed in the great examples of faith in Hebrews chapter 12. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And James chapter 2 verse 25, when talking about faith in works, he says, "You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone." In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Rahab becomes a great example of faith in action. And what we see in her faith is two things. With her heart being melted, she has a great confession about who God is. She declares that he is mighty against any opponent, that he is more majestic than anything else in this world. He is worthy of praise. He is worthy of worship. She was humbled That's why her heart melted in fear. When you stand before someone who is worthy of your worship, you are rightfully exposed in your vulnerabilities. But not only does she confess that there is one God, but she also pleads to this God for mercy. With her heart melted, with a realization of her need, she pleads for mercy and asks for salvation. And what we see is that God is powerful to deliver mercy. And so for us, when we configure our perceptions of God based on our experiences, we're at danger at both either losing the great confession about how other God is. We can easily become too comfortable that God is my mate, that we are part of the hot fold, that we become a bit immune to his holiness, that we become blind to our brokenness. And so there's a great reminder that we must continue to confess that God is other. That should experience within us a heart being melted with fear, a loss of confidence in our own capacity and ability. But then from that leads towards this great plea for mercy. No matter what we do, no matter the sin that is exposed in our heart, no matter how far away we feel from God, he delivers mercy. He desires and has the ability to draw people who are far away, people who are totally messed up and broken. He can draw them to himself and he can restore them and make them whole. Friends, God delivers mercy. This is great news. We shouldn't forget this. This should shape the way that we relate to him and the way that we present him to those in this world, as we all are people in desperate need of God's mercy.